Okay. Well, I have to give a little spiel on the council first because it hopefully sets the stage for what we're trying to talk about today. The organization I work for is it's a very unique organization. It is technically, if you know the law term, it's a regional compact or an interstate compact. I work on the central staff, and we support council members that are appointed by the governors of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. And as you might gather from that, that means that some of what we do is political. But we were created by an act of Congress to do some very specific things. One of them was to develop a fish and wildlife program to protect and mitigate and enhance kind of the capabilities in the hydroelectric facilities to kind of accommodate fish and wildlife based on the disruption due to the hydroelectric dams. And then we also are developing a power plant. So we have kind of a fish and wildlife side and then a power division side. And then while we're doing all of this, we involve the public. And when I say we involve the public, I mean, I know that I used to work at Portland General, so like there were stakeholders and it was like there's an IRP process. I will say that our public process is, it's both in some ways more collegial than an IRP process, but it is very open, which is really nice. So if you ever need anything, you can ask us, we'll share anything with you. We kind of don't really have skin in the game. We're broadly independent. So, but the thing we're talking about today is a little bit how we support the power plan using Aurora and some very specific topics here. So when we say that we do regional planning, what we're really trying to do is come up with an adequate, efficient, economical, and reliable regional power supply through the next 20 years. We, like many IRPs or something else, we also focus on, say, the first 5 years or so as kind of like an action plan time period. And under the Northwest Power Act, so this is kind of like what's the use case for our power plan? So Bonneville Power Administration makes decisions that are consistent with what we do. So it's not, that's kind of our direct effect. Also, we are an independent reference for utilities, regulators, and policymakers. So we have a pretty broad public forum that is interested in our work. There's even some states, like the state of Washington, have some laws that talk about kind of following the council's direction. And so we do have, I would say, from the most part, the way to characterize the power that we have, it's broadly with Bonneville Power Administration and kind of them being consistent. And to some extent, we have a little bit of a bully pulpit because both utilities and regulators are kind of listening to what we say. So that's kind of the use case for when we're putting out a power plan, what we're thinking about politically. As folks know, there's been a lot of changes recently in the power industry. It's kind of silly to say that at this point, but I think it's an important context. And even when we're doing regional planning, so we're not just thinking about our own portfolio, we have to think about the broader WECC. And one of the reasons why, especially for us, we think about the entire Western grid is that hydropower can be somewhere between like 40 to 90% of our region's power supply. So not like the whole WECC, but it's a pretty big part. So that amount of variability requires us to really evaluate what we think about market risk. And more and more, market risk is starting to be defined by different types of fundamentals. So the hydro system is defined by kind of the variability of climate and weather already. But as as we see more and more state and municipal and federal policies, you can see that more and more of the power system is going to be incentivized to move to renewable power, which is also affected by climate and weather, and it kind of creates this confluence of variability. And so when we're trying to think about what the build size is for our market assessment, we really are trying to kind of get as close as we can to understanding that, because the variability of the hydro system is really, it's a big risk for us. And so understanding if that market will be available is important. Okay, so high level, getting into the Aurora stuff. What do? We use the capital expansion model, and then we use the production cost simulation. We use them in a couple different ways. We do use the capital expansion to support some of our adequacy works, understanding what the market is for our adequacy model. We also use it as kind of the first step to get the fundamentals right for some of our price modeling and an avoided emissions rate studies. When I say avoided emissions rate, think like marginal, like market emissions you might associate with the market purchase. And we run it over a number of different hydro, load, and wind conditions. And right now we're using climate change informed data, so the data is kind of synthetic. It's coming from general circulation models, and it is synced. So we have to sync the load, the hydro, and the wind in Aurora right now. Okay. So kind of getting to what the issue at hand is. So recently, before there were kind of just RPS policies, I wouldn't say that we'd reached a threshold where meeting those policies was causing a whole lot of problems for us in Aurora. We could just use kind of the long-term energy minimum, meet RPS policies. It mixed with maybe buying some combined cycle gas plants, and you kind of would see what was happening in the model, and it made a lot of sense. Now the requirements, now that there's kind of these non-emitting requirements, or what I'm going to call clean requirements, and so that's actually what we're talking about. So like the dispatch down of, say, renewables, hydro, things like that. And so what we're going to be talking about today is a little bit kind of a trick that we use to get that to work a little bit better in kind of this high policy future. So the first thing that we tried was, I think like a lot of folks maybe, based on what I've been hearing, talking to you all, is we tried using like a negative bid adder. So say you've got kind of a forecast of a REC price, or you have a PTC. It basically says, look, there's some there's value you're foregoing. If you dispatch down a renewable, you're not getting the full value of that product, and so therefore you should be compensated. And so the idea is, if you put say a negative bid adder on it, it's incentivizing Aurora to not dispatch that resource down first. Maybe it chooses to do something else, or if it has to, it'll dispatch it down. So what we tried to do, and we've kind of gone through several different iterations of this, is we've tried to come up with some reasonable negative bid adders. As folks also know, negative bid adders are kind of fraught with peril, but we still are attempting it. So the question is, how do you get the right size? And kind of the renewable curtailment problem, like I would associate that with, and when I say renewable curtailment, I'm really just talking about dispatching below its capability in Aurora, which we're looking at as kind of how I would think about renewable curtailment in the model. So one of the things is given these large annual policy requirements and a number of different system attributes like limited transfer capability, limited storage resources, minimum generation requirements, and resource adequacy, when you're trying to think about what the right price is to put on this, it's not so easy to see, especially if you don't have somebody that does your REC and clean credit price forecasting for you. And we were unable to find a source for this information. And so we don't have an organized market throughout the West either, as folks probably know. So we also didn't have like a market source to point to. So we're kind of forced to come up with this technique to try to estimate it. And so I apologize to Energy Exemplar. I'm sure we're abusing Aurora in this case, but we kind of are trying to trick the model's functionality to use a very specific part of it. And this is broadly the process. You do a test to see if you need to even be giving a negative bid adder to the model to get it to comply with the policy requirements. If you do, then you kind of go through the steps that I'm going to describe, which are you set up a build for policy constraints, and you try to isolate that as much as you can. So there's a lot nested in that, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And then you kind of iterate back and forth until you get to a good place where the negative bid adders are enforcing the policies the way you want, and then you can put it back in a regular long-term capital expansion. So in this case, if you're following along the slides, they should have been color-coded for that little flow diagram, but if you want to determine if the process is necessary, it's pretty easy. You know what your requirements are, you know what the constraints are, and does the output equal those constraints in a given year? Maybe you have a smoothing way, your interpretation of the policies, but broadly, if the output's not meeting it, you may have built plenty of resources. You can see here the capability. You might not quite be able to see it, but the yellow and the gray, respectively, are the clean and the RPS capability, which is well above the requirements. But you can see that in practice, in this particular run, the output wasn't actually meeting the requirements. And so in this case, this is one of the cases that we had where we needed to do something to try to show that there was some value. So Aurora was clearly building enough resources, but maybe it was building them in the wrong places to bring it to load, or there wasn't enough incentive to actually run those units. It was cheaper to dispatch down. So what we would do is you kind of copy your original change set. So you start off with whatever scenario you want to look at, and then you start basically messing around on the new resources table. And high level, what we were trying to do is remove some of the things that might pollute the price signal we were going to access, which is going to be, as you'll see, the shadow price from the constraint summary table. And some of the things that might do that would be, why would you buy a renewable? Well, you could buy it for adequacy, right? You might be buying it to relieve a transmission constraint, or you might be doing it just for pure economics, regardless of those policy constraints. And so what we tried to do is really isolate that. So the way that we dealt with eliminating adequacy constraints is we gave the model a bunch of free, we'll just say, from a fixed cost perspective, simple cycle units with a very high heat rate. So it was kind of the resource of last resort. Not perfect, but at least gets you an adequate system. Occasionally you would run into still some load problems, and so we also gave it an unlimited supply of batteries for free. I guess. Like the battery still functioned the same way a battery would function on a variable cost basis, but from a fixed cost basis, you didn't need to make a capital investment. And then we removed all the other resources like combined cycles that might get purchased or something for economics that didn't have a clean or an RPS requirement. So once we did that, when we performed the long-term capital expansion, fundamentally then all you're trying to do, at least what we were trying to do, is meet the policy constraints, right? You should only be building to meet the policy constraints because there should be no planning reserve margin concerns, a lot of the other things you're doing. So we were really just trying to isolate the part of the objective function that we wanted. And so high level what we did is we just looked at the constraint summary table after we completed the capital expansion with this special setup that I just described, and the shadow prices that we saw that were next to the constraints. We took a look at those shadow prices, and we thought that they would be a good proxy for a negative bid adder. The idea being that the shadow price is what would happen if you relaxed that policy constraint by 1 megawatt hour. So we were thinking that was a pretty decent proxy. Our advisory committees also thought it was a reasonable method to try to attempt. And sometimes, for some of the scenarios, we did have to iterate a few times for this to be right, but we were able to kind of get there, and we were even able to get there with a little bit of sampling. We weren't having to do full hourly runs. I think it was a little quicker when you did it with a full hourly run, but anyway, high level, the next step is you just rerun that long-term capital expansion with those prices, and if it enforces it, then you're good to go. And so that's kind of what we found. So you're testing it to see if it meets the policies in that kind of simplified policy run. And if it does, then you test it in your long-term capital expansion. And for us, we were able to get that. And so what were we seeing? What we were seeing is that for the most part, you can see that there weren't really shadow prices. They were like zero or broadly not available. If the constraint's not binding, the price isn't that high. But the minute the constraint becomes binding, say in about 2030, as you all being familiar with, the price starts to go up and it starts to become more pricey to back down those units, at least the way that we're utilizing those prices. There's a number of things you can do to kind of match between rec and clean prices to kind of pick whichever constraint is more binding. There's a few subtle things that we did. You can do some smoothing and whatnot, but high level, once you put those prices in as negative bid adders in that long-term capital expansion in your resources and new resources table, you kind of get fairly stable results. We were actually able to use it for a number of sensitivities, so it's a pretty decent process, I think, to get a kind of a fundamentals-based approach for what RECs or clean credit pricing might be. I will say, this is my caveat, I should have given this in the beginning, but this is kind of a little bit of a work in progress. It worked for us in our last setup. I don't know that everybody has the same setup. Because we're using the Western Interconnect, this is what we used. But I also think there's probably a lot of variation here, and there's more work to be done. Then you can probably come up with a more robust way of doing this. This is just our first pass, but it seemed to be giving us results that made sense to us. And so, yeah, that's it.